By 1943, German soldiers along the Eastern Front had developed a peculiar fear. Not of tanks, not of artillery, but of silence itself. When the night grew still and the wind carried only whispers, they knew death was gliding toward them on wooden wings. Over 23,000 bombing missions would haunt their dreams, carried out by an enemy they never saw coming. Soviet women who transformed flimsy biplanes into instruments of psychological warfare so effective that seasoned Wehrmacht veterans would rather face a panzer division than hear the gentle rustle of fabric wings cutting through. Darkness. The sound began as nothing more than a soft whisper, like wind, through wheat fields back home in Bavaria or Brandenburg. German sentries would strain their ears, wondering if their minds were playing tricks after months of sleepless nights in frozen trenches. Then came the telltale flutter of canvas and wood, growing closer, until suddenly the whisper became a roar and the sky erupted in fire. October 7th, 1941. Outside Morozovsk airfield. Wehrmacht. Sergeant Klaus Richter pressed his face against cold earth as explosions tore through the darkness above him. Nightmares, he would later write to his wife. They come like nightmares, silent, invisible, gone before you can even scream. What Richter couldn't know was that his tormentor was barely 19 years old, flying a biplane so outdated it belonged in a museum, guided only by a compass and the kind of courage that would make grown men weep. This wasn't supposed to happen. Germany's war machine had steamrolled across Europe with ruthless efficiency. Their pilots flew cutting-edge Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. Their ground forces wielded the most advanced weapons on Earth. Yet here they were, terrorized by what their own intelligence reports dismissively called women in flying coffins. The irony would have been laughable if it hadn't been so absolutely, bone-chillingly effective. The whispers in the dark belonged to the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, women who would earn a nickname that still sends shivers down spines 8 decades later. The Night Witches had awakened, and the Eastern Front would never sleep peacefully again. But every nightmare has an origin, and this one began with a dream. 2 years earlier, when Wehrmacht boots first thundered across Soviet soil, a young woman named Marina Raskova sat in her Moscow office surrounded by letters that would change the course of history. Thousands of them written in desperate hands by daughters, mothers, factory workers, and university students, all begging for the same impossible thing, the chance to fight back. Let us fly, they pleaded. Let us serve. Let us die for the motherland if we must, but don't let us sit idle while our country burns. Raskova understood their anguish better than most. As the Soviet Union's most celebrated female aviator, she had shattered records and inspired a generation of women to look skyward. Now, as German forces carved through her homeland like a blade through flesh, she felt the weight of every desperate letter, every patriotic plea. The men were dying by the millions. Traditional thinking said women belonged in factories, not cockpits. But traditional thinking, Raskova realized, wasn't winning this war. In the autumn of 1941, she walked into Stalin's office with a proposal that would have seemed absurd if not for the dire circumstances. 3 all-female Air Force regiments. Not support units, not auxiliary roles, combat squadrons that would fly and fight alongside their male counterparts. The timing couldn't have been more desperate. German armies stood at the gates of Moscow. Leningrad lay under siege, and Soviet air power was bleeding away one dogfight at a time. Stalin, pragmatist above all else, saw opportunity in desperation. If women wanted to die for the motherland, he would give them that chance. Order number 0099 was signed on October 8, 1941, authorizing the formation of 3 female air regiments. Within weeks, volunteers flooded training centers across the Soviet Union. They came from universities and collective farms, from urban apartments and Siberian villages. Some were experienced pilots. Others had never seen an airplane up close. What united them wasn't skill, it was rage. 20-year-old Nadezhda Popova abandoned her philosophy studies the day she learned her brother had died at Stalingrad. I wanted revenge, she would recall decades later. I wanted every German to know that Soviet women were coming for them. 19-year-old Irina Sebrova left her comfortable life in Moscow after witnessing a Luftwaffe raid tear through a children's hospital. I stopped being a girl that day, she remembered. I became a weapon. The training camps filled with young women who had traded textbooks for flight manuals, evening gowns for flying suits that hung loose on their slender frames. They learned to navigate by stars, to calculate bomb trajectories, to survive in aircraft that offered no armor, no protection beyond their own skill and determination. Most had never imagined they would spend their 20th birthdays learning how to kill. Marina Raskova moved among them, like a general preparing for the most important battle of her life. She knew what they faced, not just German bullets, but the skepticism of their own military, the scorn of male pilots who viewed them as publicity stunts rather than warriors. Every mistake would be magnified, every failure attributed to their gender rather than the chaos of war. They would have to be twice as brave, twice as skilled, twice as relentless as any man, and they would have to prove it night after night over enemy territory. By winter 1941, the 508th Night Bomber Regiment was taking shape under Raskova's iron discipline. These women, many still teenagers, would fly the most dangerous missions in aviation, low-altitude night bombing runs over heavily defended targets. Their aircraft would be Polikarpov PO-2 biplanes, training planes so obsolete they had been relegated to crop dusting and mail delivery. Maximum speed, 94 miles per hour. Armor plating, none. Defensive weapons, none. Life expectancy in combat, measured in weeks, not months. The male pilots at Engels Airfield watched these preparations with a mixture of amusement and pity. Women flying combat missions in flying coffins. It seemed like dark comedy rather than military strategy. They couldn't have known they were witnessing the birth of legend. The skepticism only deepened as the women struggled with equipment designed for men twice their size. Parachutes dragged on the ground behind them. Flying suits required constant alteration. Some pilots were so small they had to sit on cushions to see over the cockpit. Even their own ground crews wondered if this experiment would end in tragedy before it began. But something remarkable happened during those harsh winter training sessions. What the women lacked in physical strength, they compensated for with precision, creativity, and an almost supernatural ability to adapt. They discovered that their lighter weight allowed for more fuel and bombs. Their smaller frames made them less visible in cramped cockpits. Most importantly, their PO-2 biplanes, slow, wooden, and seemingly worthless, possessed one incredible advantage. They were nearly invisible to radar. Lieutenant Yekaterina Budanova was among the first to recognize the potential. During a practice bombing run, she cut her engine while still airborne and glided silently toward the target. The effect was ghostly. No engine noise, just the whisper of wind through canvas wings. "We're not flying fighters," she told her squadron mates. "We're flying shadows." The realization transformed everything. If they couldn't outrun German fighters, they would disappear into darkness. If they couldn't outgun enemy defenses, they would strike without warning and vanish before retaliation. The PO-2's weaknesses would become their greatest strengths, turning a collection of obsolete trainers into the most feared aircraft on the Eastern Front. Their first combat mission came on June 2, 1942. 3 PO-2s lifted off from Krasnodar airfield as the sun set behind them, carrying 100-kilogram bombs toward German positions near the Caucasus. The pilots, Popova, Sebrova, and Antonina Koklova, had trained for this moment through months of brutal preparation, but nothing could have prepared them for the reality of war. As they approached enemy lines, searchlights swept the sky like deadly fingers, probing for targets. Anti-aircraft guns opened up, filling the air with tracers and shrapnel. Below them, German soldiers scrambled for cover, but they were scanning the sky for the roar of engines, the familiar silhouette of Soviet fighters. Instead, they heard only wind. Popova cut her engine first, gliding silently over a supply depot. Her bombs fell with surgical precision, igniting fuel stores and ammunition dumps. By the time the Germans realized they were under attack, she had vanished into the darkness. Her engine restarted, already climbing toward safety. Minutes later, Sebrova's bombs shattered a communications center. Then Koklova obliterated a vehicle convoy. 3 targets, 3 direct hits, 0 casualties among the attackers. The German after-action reports from that night reflect bewilderment more than fear. Attack by unknown aircraft, low-flying, silent approach, possibly new Soviet stealth technology. They couldn't comprehend that their tormentors were women flying biplanes held together with fabric and wire. But the Night Witches were just getting started. What had begun as an experiment was about to become a nightmare that would haunt the Wehrmacht for 3 long years. The tactics that made the Night Witches legendary were born from desperation and perfected through repetition. Each mission followed the same terrifying pattern. Approach the target area at altitude with engines running normally, then cut power and glide silently toward the objective. The sudden silence was their signature, a moment of deadly calm before devastation erupted from the darkness. Nadia Popova, who would eventually complete 852 combat missions, described the sensation. You become one with the darkness. The plane disappears beneath you. The earth disappears below you. There is only you, your bombs, and the target. Time stops. Fear stops. Everything stops except your mission. The Po-2's wood and canvas construction, initially seen as a fatal weakness, proved to be brilliant camouflage. German radar operators, accustomed to tracking metal aircraft, often missed the biplanes entirely. When they did achieve radar contact, the slow-speed confused targeting systems designed for faster planes. Messerschmitt pilots found themselves overshooting their targets, unable to slow down enough to engage aircraft flying barely above stall speed. Soviet mechanics, initially skeptical of their female pilots, soon developed an almost mystical respect for the women who returned each dawn with aircraft shot full of holes, but still flying. Senior Lieutenant Viktor Petrov, a veteran ground crew chief, remembered, "They would land with wings shredded by flak, fuel tanks leaking, instruments destroyed, but they always brought their planes home." Male pilots with the same damage would have bailed out. These women rode their aircraft down like they were living things. The psychological impact on German forces was immediate and devastating. Wehrmacht diaries from the period reveal a mounting paranoia about night operations. "The Russians have ghosts," wrote Corporal Hans Müller to his family in Bavaria. "They come without sound, without warning. You never see them, never hear them until it's too late. How do you fight an enemy that doesn't exist until the moment she kills you?" The fear was justified. By late 1942, the 588th Regiment was conducting up to 15 missions per night, with individual pilots sometimes flying 8 sorties between sunset and dawn. They targeted everything: supply convoys, ammunition dumps, headquarters buildings, troop concentrations, airfields. No German position was safe after dark. The constant harassment shattered sleep patterns, disrupted supply lines, and created a climate of terror that spread far beyond the actual damage inflicted. German anti-aircraft crews developed a particular dread of still nights when the wind dropped to nothing. In complete silence, they could hear the night witches coming from miles away, a distant whisper of fabric and wood that grew steadily louder until bombs began falling. Searchlight operators would sweep frantically across empty sky, often illuminating nothing but darkness, while destruction rained down around them. The Luftwaffe's attempts to intercept the night witches became exercises in futility. Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s would climb to intercept what radar identified as slow-moving targets, only to find empty sky. The Po-2s flew too low for effective radar tracking and too slow for fighter aircraft designed for high-speed combat. German pilots reported firing at shadows, chasing ghosts, burning precious fuel in pursuit of aircraft that seemed to vanish the moment they were engaged. Flight Sergeant Werner Hoffmann, a Luftwaffe ace with 12 confirmed kills, wrote in his diary, "I would rather face a squadron of yaks than one of these damned night spirits. At least with fighters, you know what you're fighting. These women, they're not human. They're something else entirely." The nickname Night Witches originated from German soldiers who claimed the women practiced dark magic to achieve such impossible feats. Soviet propaganda initially resisted the term, viewing it as derogatory, but the pilots themselves embraced it with fierce pride. If the Germans wanted to call them witches, they would be the most terrifying witches in history. Lieutenant Yekaterina Ryabova, who flew 960 combat missions, explained the appeal. "A witch has power over men's minds. She strikes fear into hearts that know no other fear. If that's what we were to them, then we were witches gladly. Let them wake screaming from dreams of silent wings and wooden death." The terror spread beyond frontline troops to rear area units who had believed themselves safe from Soviet air power. Night witches ranged deep into German-held territory, striking targets that conventional bombers couldn't reach without massive losses. Railway stations, fuel depots, communication centers, nothing was beyond their reach. German commanders found themselves posting sentries and anti-aircraft guns hundreds of miles behind the front lines, never knowing where the next silent attack might materialize. By 1943, Wehrmacht psychological warfare units identified the night witches as a primary threat to German morale. Internal reports recommended increased leave rotation for frontline troops, additional recreational facilities, and improved night lighting for defensive positions. The suggestions revealed the depth of the problem. An entire army was suffering from chronic sleep deprivation and paranoid anxiety caused by women flying obsolete biplanes. Fear was so pervasive that German soldiers began attributing all manner of mysterious events to the night witches. Equipment failures, accidental explosions, unexplained fires, everything became evidence of supernatural Soviet aviation. The rational explanations mattered less than the psychological. Reality. The darkness itself had become an enemy. Weapon. But the cost of wielding. That weapon was written in blood and sacrifice. Across 3 years of relentless combat. From the German perspective, the Eastern Front after 1942 became a waking nightmare, where safety existed only in the brief hours between sunrise and sunset. Wehrmacht veteran accounts describe a gradual erosion of confidence, a creeping paranoia that infected everything from routine patrols to major offensive operations. Obergefreiter Johann Steiner, stationed with the 24th Panzer Division near Kursk, wrote to his wife in Stuttgart, "The days belong to us, but the nights belong to them. You learn to sleep during artillery barrages, because at least shells make noise. It's the silence that kills you, waiting, listening, knowing they're coming, but not knowing when or where. Maria, I'm not afraid of dying. I'm afraid of never sleeping again." The psychological warfare was devastatingly effective because it was entirely unintentional. The night witches hadn't set out to terrorize German forces. Terror was simply the inevitable result of their tactics. The combination of silent approach, precision strikes, and impossible evasion created an enemy that existed more in the imagination than in reality. And imagination, as any soldier knows, can be the cruelest torturer of all. German intelligence reports from the period reveal the extent of the confusion. Units reported being attacked by ghost squadrons of up to 50 aircraft, when in reality they had been hit by perhaps 3 or 4 PO2s making multiple passes. The darkness, the fear, and the adrenaline of combat magnified every encounter, transforming limited tactical strikes into epic aerial assaults in the minds of traumatized survivors. Major Klaus von Witzleben, a decorated Wehrmacht officer who later served as a military historian, analyzed the phenomenon in his post-war memoirs. The night witches achieved something that no amount of conventional bombing could accomplish. They made an entire army afraid of the dark. Fear is a force multiplier, and these women weaponized it with surgical precision. We were not just fighting Soviet pilots. We were fighting our own imagination, our own exhaustion, our own slowly cracking nerves. The Luftwaffe's failure to stop the nocturnal raids compounded the psychological damage. German air superiority, one of the Wehrmacht's most important tactical advantages, seemed meaningless against an enemy that flew beneath their radar and moved too slowly for their fighters to engage effectively. Pilots who had dominated Soviet skies during daylight hours found themselves helpless spectators to nightly humiliation. Hauptmann Rudolf Sinner, an ace with 39 confirmed kills, attempted to develop specialized tactics for intercepting night witches. His experiments with low-altitude, slow-speed intercepts resulted in the loss of 3 aircraft and 2 pilots without achieving a single confirmed victory. "Trying to catch a Po-2 in a Messerschmitt," he wrote, "is like trying to swat a mosquito with a sledgehammer. The tool is too powerful for the target, and the mosquito will kill you while you're swinging." The failure to defend against the night witches created a crisis of confidence throughout the German command structure. If the mighty Luftwaffe couldn't stop women flying training planes, what else might prove beyond their capabilities? The doubt was subtle but corrosive, eating away at the certainty that had carried German forces across Europe. Letters home reveal the gradual mental deterioration of soldiers exposed to constant night attacks. Sleep deprivation became epidemic. nervous breakdowns increased dramatically. Medical officers reported treating more cases of combat fatigue and anxiety disorders than actual combat wounds in some sectors. The Night Witches were winning a war of attrition, not just against German equipment and supplies, but against German sanity itself. The most chilling accounts come from German defensive positions that endured sustained Night Witch harassment for months at a time. Soldiers described developing an almost supernatural sensitivity to sound, the ability to distinguish between wind through trees and wind through aircraft rigging, between settling equipment and approaching engines. They learned to recognize the subtle acoustic signatures that preceded attack, the distant whisper of fabric wings, the soft rush of air over wooden struts, the barely perceptible change in atmospheric pressure that meant death was gliding toward them. Some developed elaborate superstitions and rituals designed to protect against night attacks. Lucky charms, specific arrangements of personal equipment, prayers to gods both Christian and pagan, anything that might provide psychological armor against an enemy that seemed to possess supernatural abilities. German medical officers noted that soldiers who survived multiple Night Witch attacks often exhibited symptoms similar to shell shock, but with a crucial difference. They remained functional during daylight hours and broke down only after sunset. The terror reached its peak during the winter of 1942-43, when the Night Witches conducted their most intensive campaign in support of the Stalingrad offensive. German positions around the doomed city endured nightly bombing for months, creating a climate of perpetual anxiety that senior officers identified as a significant factor in the eventual collapse of German resistance. By 1943, Wehrmacht training manuals included specific sections on defending against low-altitude night attacks, acknowledging officially what soldiers had known for months. The war in the East had acquired a supernatural dimension that conventional military doctrine couldn't address. The recommendations were practical, but revealed the depth of German desperation. Establish listening posts equipped with the most sensitive available sound detection equipment, maintain continuous illumination of defensive positions regardless of fuel costs, rotate personnel frequently to prevent psychological breakdown. None of it worked. The Night Witches continued their campaign of terror with mechanical precision. Night after night, month after month, until the very darkness became a weapon in Soviet hands. But behind the legend, behind the fear they inspired in German hearts, lay a reality of constant danger and heartbreaking loss that would have broken weaker spirits. The romanticized image of Night Witches gliding serenely through starlit skies masked a brutal truth. They were flying suicide missions in aircraft, held together by little more than hope and determination. The Po-2 biplane offered its crew exactly zero protection against enemy fire. No armor plating, no self-sealing fuel tanks, no defensive weapons beyond the pilot's ability to maneuver. A single machine gun burst could transform the wooden aircraft into a flying torch, and German anti-aircraft fire turned the night sky into a constellation of deadly tracers. Senior Lieutenant Lydia Litviak, who would become the first female fighter ace in history before transferring to the Night Witch Regiment, described her first bombing mission in stark terms. "You're flying a kite made of matchsticks into a hurricane of fire. Every minute in the air is borrowed time. Every landing is a small miracle. You learn not to think about tomorrow because tomorrow might not exist." The casualty rates tell the story in numbers that no amount of propaganda could soften. Of the original 261 women who served with the 588th Night Bomber Regiment throughout the war, 32 were killed in action, a mortality rate of over 12%. In conventional bomber squadrons, such losses would have been considered catastrophic. For the Night Witches, flying missions that were inherently suicidal, they represented a kind of miracle. But statistics couldn't capture the human cost of constant exposure to mortal danger. Many of the women were barely out of their teens, thrust into combat situations that would have challenged veteran pilots. They learned to navigate by stars because their aircraft lacked sophisticated instruments. They calculated bombing approaches by instinct and experience because their planes carried no targeting computers. Most critically, they flew without radios, making each mission a solitary journey into darkness from which there might be no return. The isolation was perhaps the cruelest aspect of their service. Unlike fighter pilots who flew in formations and could rely on wingmen for support, or bomber crews who shared danger with their comrades, night witches flew alone into enemy territory. If their engine failed, if they were hit by flak, if they became lost in cloud cover, there was no one to help, no one even to witness their final moments. Navigator Yekaterina Fedotova, who completed 470 combat missions, remembered the loneliness as much as the fear. You're surrounded by enemies who want to kill you, flying a plane that could fall apart at any moment, navigating by guesswork toward targets that bristle with guns, and you're completely alone. Not just physically alone, but existentially alone. In those moments, you discover who you really are when stripped of everything except will. The mechanical reliability of their aircraft became a constant source of anxiety. Po-2 biplanes were simple machines, but simplicity offered no guarantee against the stresses of combat flying. Engines overheated, fuel lines leaked, control surfaces tore away in the slipstream. Ground crews performed miracles of improvisation, patching bullet holes with fabric scraps, welding cracked engine mounts, rebuilding entire aircraft from salvaged parts. But no amount of maintenance could eliminate the fundamental reality. They were flying combat missions in training planes never designed for such punishment. Weather added another layer of mortal danger. Night bombing required clear visibility to identify targets and navigate home, but clear skies also meant perfect conditions for German night fighters and anti-aircraft guns. Cloud cover provided concealment, but made navigation nearly impossible for pilots relying on visual landmarks. Rain turned fabric control surfaces sluggish and unpredictable. Ice accumulation could bring down an aircraft within minutes. The night witches learned to fly in conditions that grounded conventional bomber squadrons, accepting risks that more cautious commanders would have deemed unacceptable. The physical demands of their missions pushed human endurance to its limits. Individual pilots regularly flew 8 to 10 sorties per night, landing only long enough to refuel, rearm, and receive new target assignments. They operated in open cockpits during Russian winters, when temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Frostbite was common, exhaustion universal, and combat fatigue an accepted fact of life rather than grounds for medical leave. Major Yelena Malyutina, who commanded a squadron within the regiment, described the cumulative effect. After 6 months of operations, we weren't the same women who had volunteered for service. We were something harder, something colder. You had to become cold to survive. Sentiment was a luxury we couldn't afford when our friends were dying around us. The deaths, when they came, were often sudden and absolute. A Po-2 hit by anti-aircraft fire didn't glide to a forced landing. It disintegrated in mid-air or plummeted to earth as a ball of flame. The wooden construction that made the aircraft invisible to radar also made it incredibly vulnerable to incendiary rounds. Many night witches simply vanished during missions, their fate unknown until wreckage was discovered days or weeks later, if it was discovered at all. Lieutenant Rufina Gasheva, who flew 848 combat missions and survived the war, carried the memory of lost friends for the rest of her life. They were there at briefing, laughing at some joke, complaining about the cold, planning what they would do after the war. 6 hours later, they were scattered across a German field in pieces too small to identify. You learned not to get too close to people, because getting close meant sharing their pain when they died. The survivors developed coping mechanisms that bordered on the supernatural. They learned to compartmentalize fear, boxing it away during missions and releasing it only during the brief respites between operations. They created elaborate rituals around preparation for flight, treating each pre-mission routine as a sacred ceremony that might influence their survival. Most importantly, they cultivated a fatalistic acceptance of death that allowed them to function in situations where rational analysis would have produced paralysis. Yet despite the constant presence of death, despite the mechanical failures and weather hazards and enemy fire, the night witches never wavered in their commitment to their missions. Their dedication transcended mere patriotism or military duty. It became a kind of religious faith, a belief that their sacrifice was purchasing something infinitely precious, the survival of their homeland and the future of their people. This faith would sustain them through the darkest hours of the war, when victory seemed impossible and death appeared to be the only certainty in an uncertain world. As 1943 dawned over the Eastern Front, the strategic situation that had birthed the Night Witches began to shift. The Soviet Union, bled white but still breathing, was transforming industrial desperation into military might. New aircraft rolled off production lines, veteran pilots emerged from training schools, and the Red Air Force began to challenge German air superiority with conventional tactics and modern equipment. But the Night Witches had transcended their original role as a stopgap measure born from desperate circumstances. They had become something far more valuable, a psychological weapon that struck at the very heart of German confidence. Their nightly raids, initially designed to harass and disrupt, had evolved into a systematic campaign of mental warfare that complemented major Soviet offensives with devastating effectiveness. The Battle of Kursk, Germany's last great offensive gamble on the Eastern Front, demonstrated the strategic value of sustained psychological pressure. While massive tank battles raged during daylight hours, the Night Witches intensified their campaign against German rear areas, supply lines, and command centers. Their bombing runs disrupted sleep, shattered communications, and created a climate of perpetual anxiety that sapped German fighting effectiveness, even before the 1st Panzer crossed the start line. Lieutenant Colonel Yevdokia Bershanskaya, who had assumed command of the 588th Regiment after Marina Raskova's death in 1943, understood perfectly the role her women played in the larger strategic picture. "We are not just dropping bombs," she told her pilots during a pre-mission briefing in July 1943. "We are dropping fear. We are making the Germans understand that nowhere is safe, that darkness itself has become their enemy. Every mission makes their next day a little harder, their resolve a little weaker." The numbers from the Kursk period tell the story of sustained tactical pressure that achieved strategic results. Between July 5 and August 23, 1943, the Night Witches flew over 3,000 individual sorties, delivering nearly 300 tons of bombs against German positions. The physical damage was significant but not decisive. Far more important was the cumulative psychological impact on German forces already stretched to the breaking point by massive daylight battles. German after-action. Reports from Kursk reference severe morale, problems and combat effectiveness degraded by sleep, deprivation and anxiety disorders. Units that should have been fresh for major engagements arrived at jump-off points already exhausted by weeks of nightly harassment. Tank crews who needed rest between battles found themselves manning defensive positions after dark, scanning empty skies for threats that materialized without warning and vanished like smoke. The strategic breakthrough came during the Soviet counter-offensive that followed the German defeat at Kursk. As Red Army forces pressed westward, the Night Witches adapted their tactics to support advancing ground units. They shifted from pure harassment missions to direct battlefield support, bombing German defensive positions, supply convoys, and communication centers immediately ahead of Soviet advances. Major Galina Brock-Beltsova, who flew 817 combat missions during this period, described the evolution. "We became the invisible artillery of the Red Army. While our ground forces prepared for daylight attacks, we softened up enemy positions under cover of darkness. German defenders who should have been rested and alert for dawn assaults were instead exhausted, demoralized, and jumping at shadows." The psychological momentum generated by years of night harassment began to compound during the 1943-44 winter offensive. German units that had learned to fear darkness found themselves retreating through long winter nights, constantly vulnerable to attacks they couldn't see coming. The Night Witches followed the retreat, establishing forward airfields in recently liberated territory and maintaining pressure on German forces that had no opportunity to rest, regroup, or establish stable defensive lines. By early 1944, as Soviet forces crossed into pre-war Polish territory, the Night Witches had achieved something unprecedented in military history. They had weaponized an entire army's fear of the dark. German defensive doctrine now included mandatory provisions for night illumination, sound detection equipment, and rapid reaction anti-aircraft teams, all designed to counter an enemy flying obsolete biplanes with nothing more sophisticated than magnetic compasses and mechanical bomb releases. The Irony was not lost on Soviet commanders. Air Marshal Alexander Novikov, who oversaw Red Air Force operations throughout the war, noted in his memoirs, "The most modern air force in the world was being terrorized by aircraft that belonged in museums. The night witches proved that in warfare, the weapon matters less than the warrior who wields it." The strategic impact extended beyond the immediate tactical advantages. Intelligence reports reaching Berlin painted an increasingly grim picture of army morale on the Eastern Front. Experienced officers were requesting transfers away from sectors known for night witch activity. Veteran soldiers were developing psychiatric symptoms that appeared to be contagious, spreading through units like a psychological plague. Medical evacuation rates for non-combat injuries, nervous breakdowns, anxiety disorders, chronic insomnia, reached levels that threatened operational effectiveness. High command responses grew increasingly desperate. Special night fighter squadrons were formed specifically to counter the night witches, equipped with advanced radar and trained in low-altitude intercept techniques. The results were negligible. Pilots reported endless frustration chasing targets that appeared on radar for seconds before vanishing into ground clutter. Anti-aircraft concentrations were reinforced with equipment transferred from other fronts, weakening German defenses against conventional bombing raids. Nothing worked. As 1944 progressed and Soviet forces pressed deeper into Eastern Europe, the night witches followed, establishing the template for asymmetric warfare that would influence military thinking for decades to come. They had demonstrated that a relatively small force, using inferior equipment but superior tactics, could achieve strategic effects far beyond their apparent capabilities. The tide of war was turning, but the women who had helped turn it were still flying into darkness, still risking everything, still proving night after night that courage could triumph over technology, that will could overcome weapons, that the human spirit could not be conquered by any force on earth. But every tide carries debris in its wake, and the cost of victory was measured in lives that would never see the dawn of peace. The final year of the war brought a bittersweet transformation to the night witches' mission. As Soviet forces advanced deeper into German-held territory, the tactical situation that had made their obsolete biplanes so effective began to change. German air defenses, though still formidable, were increasingly focused on conventional threats: American and British bombers by day, Soviet fighter bombers, and ground attack aircraft by night. The Po-2, which had seemed impossibly vulnerable at the war's beginning, now appeared almost quaint against the backdrop of modern aerial warfare. Yet their psychological impact remained undiminished. German forces retreating through East Prussia, Poland, and eventually into the Reich itself found that geographical displacement provided no escape from their tormentors. The night witches followed every retreat, established forward bases in every liberated town, maintained their relentless pressure, regardless of how far west the front lines moved. Captain Natalia Maiklin, flying her 840th combat mission over German soil in March 1945, radioed back to base. "The forests look the same from above, but everything else has changed. We're not defending anymore, we're hunting, and the hunters have become the hunted." Her observation captured a profound shift in the psychological dynamic of the Eastern Front. The German army, which had terrorized Europe for 5 years, was now experiencing the existential fear it had inflicted on others. The final campaigns revealed the full extent of what the night witches had accomplished. Intelligence reports from captured German positions showed defensive preparations that bordered on the obsessive. Multiple layers of anti-aircraft guns, sound detection equipment, searchlight networks that consumed enormous amounts of precious fuel. Entire divisions were devoting significant resources to defending against what amounted to tactical pinpricks, but pinpricks delivered with such consistency and precision that they had become strategic wounds. Major Raisa Aronova, who completed 960 combat missions during the war, flew her last operational sortie on May 4, 1945, just days before Germany's surrender. Her target was a German supply depot outside Berlin, and her approach followed the same pattern she had perfected over 3 years of combat. Engine cut at 3,000 feet, glide to 800 feet, release bombs, restart engine, climb away into darkness. But something was different about this mission. The sky was quieter. the anti-aircraft fire less intense. The searchlights seemed to sweep with less urgency. The Germans were already beaten, she recalled decades later. You could feel it in the air. They were going through the motions of defense, but their hearts weren't in it anymore. We had spent 3 years teaching them to fear the dark, and they had learned the lesson too well. They were afraid of shadows, afraid of silence, afraid of their own imagination. They had become afraid of everything, and an army that's afraid of everything can't fight anymore. The statistics from the Night Witch's complete wartime service read like something from military fiction, rather than historical fact. 23,672 combat sorties flown, 3,000 tons of bombs delivered, targets ranging from individual vehicles to major military installations. All of this accomplished by women flying aircraft that most air forces had relegated to training roles or museum displays. The physical damage they inflicted was significant, but not decisive. The psychological victory they achieved was total and permanent. On May 15, 1945, 10 days after Germany's unconditional surrender, the surviving members of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment gathered at their final wartime base near Berlin. Of the 261 women who had served with the unit throughout the war, 229 had survived, a remarkable survival rate given the inherently dangerous nature of their missions. They stood in ranks wearing uniforms that had seen 3 years of combat, next to Po-2 aircraft that bore the scars of countless encounters with enemy fire. Colonel Yevdokia Bershanskaya, reading the official order, disbanding the regiment, paused to look at the faces of women who had aged far beyond their years. Many were still in their early 20s, but their eyes held the weight of experiences that would have broken older, supposedly stronger souls. They had volunteered as idealistic young women defending their homeland. They were mustering out as combat veterans who had redefined the very nature of warfare. The Night Witches are disbanding, Bershanskaya announced, but the Knights will never forget what we accomplished. Neither will the Germans. They may rebuild their cities. They may train new armies. They may even start new wars, but somewhere in the back of their minds, they will always remember the sound of wooden wings cutting through darkness. They will always remember that the night itself can be turned into a weapon. As the ceremony concluded, and the women began the long journey back to civilian life, many carried with them a profound sense of displacement. They had spent their formative years as instruments of warfare, their identities forged in the crucible of constant mortal danger. The transition to peacetime would prove for many almost as challenging as the war itself, but they also carried something else, the unshakable knowledge that they had participated in one of the most extraordinary military achievements in human history. They had taken obsolete equipment, inadequate training, and desperate circumstances, and forged from these unpromising materials a weapon that had helped bring the most powerful military machine in history to its knees. The sky was quiet now, the darkness peaceful once again. But the legend of the Night Witches would endure, a reminder that courage, creativity, and determination could triumph over any technological advantage, any numerical superiority, any seemingly insurmountable obstacle. The Germans, as promised, never slept peacefully again. Yet in the decades that followed, as the Soviet Union celebrated its victory and the world tried to comprehend the magnitude of the war's destruction, the women who had terrorized the Wehrmacht found themselves facing a different kind of battle, the fight for recognition in a world that preferred its heroes to be male and its warfare to be conventional. Many of the Night Witches returned to lives that seemed impossibly small after years of nightly brushes with death. Nadezhda Popova, who had flown 852 combat missions, went back to her interrupted university studies and eventually became a philosophy professor. Irina Sibrova, veteran of 1008 sorties, worked as a construction engineer. Yekaterina Budanova completed her medical training and spent 40 years as a rural doctor. They had saved their country and helped win the greatest war in history. But the Soviet system that had empowered them during the crisis quickly reverted to traditional expectations about women's roles in peacetime. For decades, their story remained largely untold outside the Soviet Union. Western military historians, when they acknowledged the Night Witches at all, treated them as curiosities rather than serious military innovators. The idea that women flying obsolete biplanes could have achieved strategic impact seemed too extraordinary for serious academic consideration. Cold War tensions meant that Soviet military achievements were often minimized or ignored entirely in Western accounts of the war. But the women themselves never forgot, and neither did the men who had served alongside them. Soviet Air Force veterans spoke with reverence about the Night Witches' achievements, sharing stories that grew more extraordinary with each telling, but never lost their essential truth. These women had accomplished something unprecedented in military history. The recognition, when it finally came, arrived in waves. First, Soviet military historians began documenting the regiment's achievements in detail, interviewing survivors, and compiling combat records that revealed the full scope of their accomplishments. Then, as the Cold War thawed, Western researchers gained access to previously classified materials and began reassessing the Night Witches' contribution to the war effort. Marina Raskova, the visionary who had made it all possible, had died in a flying accident in 1943 and never lived to see her experiment validated by history. But the women she had trained and inspired carried her legacy forward, becoming advocates for military aviation and women's rights in the post-war Soviet Union. Their example inspired subsequent generations of female pilots, cosmonauts and military officers who understood that barriers existed to be broken, not respected. The technological revolution that transformed military aviation in the jet age only highlighted the extraordinary nature of what the Night Witches had accomplished. Modern fighters with sophisticated radar, guided missiles and computer-controlled weapon systems represented the polar opposite of the PO-2's primitive simplicity. Yet military strategists studying asymmetric warfare found themselves returning again and again to the Night Witches' example, recognizing that their tactics prefigured everything, from Vietnam-era guerrilla aviation to modern drone warfare. The psychological dimension of their achievement proved to be their most enduring legacy. Military psychologists studying combat stress and the effects of sustained harassment. Operations found in the Night Witches a perfect case study of how small forces could achieve strategic impact through the systematic application of fear. Their methods influenced everything from special operations doctrine to counterinsurgency strategy, proving that their innovation extended far beyond the specific circumstances of the Eastern Front. As the surviving Night Witches aged, they became living connections to one of history's most extraordinary military experiments. Museums sought them out for interviews, military academies invited them as guest lecturers, and aviation enthusiasts traveled across the globe to meet women who had redefined what was possible in warfare. Each encounter reinforced the same fundamental truth. What they had accomplished transcended gender, transcended technology, transcended every conventional understanding of military capability. Today, restored Po-2 biplanes sit in aviation museums around the world, their wooden frames and fabric wings bearing plaques that try to explain how such primitive aircraft could have achieved such devastating results. The explanations inevitably fall short, because the true secret of the Night Witches lay not in their equipment, but in themselves, in their courage, their creativity, their absolute refusal to accept limitations that others considered immutable. The German soldiers who survived their encounters with the Night Witches carried the memory for the rest of their lives. In the 1970s and 1980s, as Cold War tensions eased and veterans from both sides began sharing their experiences, German accounts of the Night Witches revealed a grudging respect that had developed over the decades since the war's end. The terror had faded, but the admiration remained, acknowledgement from professional warriors that they had faced something truly extraordinary in the darkness over the Eastern Front. They were ghosts, recalled former Wehrmacht Sergeant Klaus Richter in a 1985 interview, nearly 40 years after his first encounter with the Night Witches. But they were ghosts with a purpose, ghosts who fought for something worth dying for. I hated them during the war because they made my life hell. I respect them now because they were everything a soldier should be: brave, dedicated, effective. They beat us with wooden airplanes and pure will. How do you not respect that? The Night Witches had achieved something that no military strategist could have predicted, and no amount of conventional firepower could have accomplished. They had transformed their enemies' respect for them into a kind of psychological victory that outlasted the war itself. They had proven that the human spirit, properly focused and courageously applied, could overcome any technological advantage, any numerical superiority, any seemingly insurmountable obstacle. Their legacy lives on in every pilot who pushes an aircraft beyond its design limits, in every soldier who refuses to accept defeat despite impossible odds, in every person who looks at a challenge that seems too great and decides to attempt it anyway. The Night Witches showed the world that legends are not born. They are made, one dangerous mission at a time, by people who refuse to let fear determine what is possible. The Germans never slept peacefully again, but perhaps that was never the real victory. The real victory was proving that courage has no gender, that innovation can overcome any disadvantage, and that the human spirit, when properly motivated, can accomplish literally anything. In the end, that may be the most important lesson the Night Witches left for future generations. Not that war is glorious, not that technology determines outcomes, but that ordinary people, when faced with extraordinary circumstances, can rise to heights that seem impossible until someone actually achieves them. The night sky remembers, and so should we.